A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was reading this report yesterday that described daycare as the greatest social experiment of the 21st century, and it really struck a chord because we frame it so differently depending on where we live. In the United States, we often talk about it as an economic necessity or a choice for working parents, but in other parts of the world, it is seen as either a fundamental right or, conversely, a social failure. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the impact of daycare start ages on child development across different cultures, and it is a topic that sits right at the intersection of biology, economics, and deep-seated cultural values. It is what I like to call the Daycare Paradox. Why is high-quality early intervention framed as a developmental necessity in some places, while in others, starting too early is seen as a betrayal of the biological attachment bond?
It is a massive subject, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been diving into the latest longitudinal studies on this. What is fascinating is that we often talk about daycare as this monolithic thing, like it is a single experience, when in reality the developmental impact is heavily mediated by the timing of entry and the specific cultural scaffolding surrounding the child. In the United States, we see infants starting as early as 6 weeks because of the lack of federal paid leave, whereas in parts of Scandinavia, it is almost unheard of for a child to enter a formal center before their first birthday or even later. We are essentially running two different versions of childhood in the West alone, and that is before we even look at collectivist models in the global South.
The 6-week mark always feels like a biological mismatch to me. You have this tiny human who is still very much in that 4th trimester phase, where they are essentially an external fetus, and we are already shifting them into a group care environment. Daniel is right to push us on this because the optimal age seems to be a moving target depending on who you ask and which country's data you are looking at. Are we looking at cognitive gains, or are we looking at emotional stability? Because it feels like those two things are often in tension when we talk about early start models. Is there even such a thing as a universal optimal age, or is that just a myth we tell ourselves to feel better about our policy choices?
That tension is exactly where the research gets spicy. If you look at the physiological side, specifically the cortisol response, we see some pretty clear signals. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. Studies show that infants under 12 months of age who enter full-time daycare often show a rising cortisol pattern throughout the day. In a home environment with a primary caregiver, cortisol levels typically peak in the morning and drop off as the day goes on. In a daycare setting, for that under 1-year-old cohort, we often see the opposite. The stress levels climb as the day progresses because the infant is constantly navigating a high-stimulation environment without the consistent buffering of a single primary attachment figure.
So the HPA axis is basically on high alert because the safe harbor of the parent isn't there to regulate the child's nervous system. I imagine that has to have some long-term implications for how that child handles stress later in life. It is like the child's internal thermostat is being set to high before they even know how to crawl. Moving from the biological stress response, let's look at how different societies actually structure these environments to deal with that stress. You have been waiting to tell me about the 2025 OECD report, haven't you? I saw you highlighting it earlier.
I have been indeed. The 2025 OECD report on early childhood education and care is a game changer because it tracks these kids into their teenage years across 30 different nations. What they found is that countries with universal high-quality childcare starting around age 1 show a 14% higher long-term social-emotional regulation score in adolescence compared to systems that are either purely private or start much earlier with lower oversight. The age 1 threshold seems to be a significant pivot point because by 12 months, most children have reached certain developmental milestones in attachment and mobility that make the transition less physiologically taxing. They have a sense of self that is just beginning to emerge, which allows them to interact with a group rather than just being overwhelmed by it.
It is interesting that the 14% boost is in social emotional regulation, not necessarily just standardized test scores. We often hear the argument that the earlier they start, the faster they learn. But that sounds like we are treating toddlers like they are little large language models that just need more tokens of data. If the emotional foundation is shaky because the cortisol levels were spiked for 8 hours a day as an infant, the academic gains might be a bit of a hollow victory. We are prioritizing the output of the child over the operating system of the child.
The earlier is better. Myth usually comes from a misunderstanding of the Head Start data from the late 20th century. For children from high-risk or low-resource environments, early intervention can be a massive net positive because the daycare environment provides a level of stability, nutrition, and cognitive enrichment they might not get at home. But for children in stable middle-class homes, the cognitive boost of starting at 6 months versus 18 months is negligible, while the potential for increased aggression or anxiety due to early separation is a real statistical trend we see in the data. This is why the US model is so frustrating. It prioritizes early workforce participation of the parents over the developmental buffering of the child. We have built a system that treats children as an obstacle to the gross domestic product rather than the future of the society.
This brings us to the cultural divide. We have this individualistic Western model, where it is often a binary choice between mom stays home or child goes to a center. But if you look at non-Western societies, or even more collectivist models in Europe, they use alloparenting. We talked about this a bit in episode 1159 when we looked at global parenting secrets. In those models, the start age for socialized care is early, but it isn't daycare in the sense of a commercial institution. It is a rotating cast of aunts, grandparents, and neighbors. The child is socialized early, but within a web of familiar, stable faces.
Alloparenting is the biological norm for our species. For the vast majority of human history, a child wasn't raised by one person or a rotating shift of underpaid strangers. They were raised by a stable village. The problem with the modern Western daycare model isn't necessarily the presence of other children, it is the lack of caregiver stability. In the United States, the average staff turnover in private daycare centers is around 30% annually. That is a staggering number. Imagine being a 10-month-old and having your primary non-parent caregiver disappear every 4 months. It prevents the formation of a secondary attachment bond, which is what actually buffers that cortisol response I mentioned earlier. Without that bond, the daycare is just a room full of strangers and loud noises.
30% turnover is a disaster for a child's sense of permanence. It is essentially a series of mini-traumas every time a teacher leaves. Compare that to the European models you were looking at. What is the turnover rate in, say, Germany or Norway?
In state-subsidized European models, particularly in the Nordics, the turnover is often less than 8%. In Denmark, for example, the caregivers are called pedagogues. They aren't just babysitters, they have 3.5-year degrees in social education and child development. They are treated as professionals, paid a living wage with benefits, and they stay in their roles for years. When the child enters the vuggestue, or nursery at age 1, they often have the same 2 or 3 caregivers until they transition to børnehave or kindergarten at age 3. That stability allows the child's brain to categorize the daycare as a safe, predictable environment rather than a chaotic one. The quality threshold here isn't about the toys or the curriculum, it is about the human connection.
So the impact of start age is actually a bit of a red herring if we don't talk about the quality of the stay. A child starting at 6 months in a high-stability, low-ratio environment might actually fare better than a child starting at 18 months in a chaotic, high-turnover center. But the US policy seems to ignore this. We focus so much on access and affordability, which are important, don't get me wrong, but we treat the actual developmental mechanism as a black box. We are so obsessed with the where and the when that we forget the who.
We prioritize workforce participation. In contrast, the French crèche system is designed with a pedagogical focus that is almost philosophical. It is state subsidized and highly regulated, but even there you see a cultural debate. There is a strong emphasis on le cadre, or the framework. In a French crèche, children are taught to be part of a collective very early. They eat multi-course meals together, they are taught to wait their turn, and there is a high value placed on autonomy. It works for their culture because they value social cohesion and Republican values, whereas an American parent might see that same system as being too rigid or institutional. The French model assumes the child is a citizen in training, while the American model often treats the child as a consumer in waiting.
It is the daycare as storage versus daycare as scaffolding argument. I think most parents feel the storage vibe when they are dropping their kid off at a place that feels like a brightly colored warehouse. But I want to go back to the stranger anxiety phase. That usually hits around 8 or 9 months. If a parent is forced to start daycare right when the child is biologically programmed to be most terrified of strangers, aren't we just setting everyone up for a traumatic transition? It seems like the worst possible timing.
That is a critical point. The 8-month peak for separation anxiety is a universal developmental milestone. It is the point where the brain's amygdala becomes more active in recognizing non-family faces. If you can wait until 12 or 14 months, the child has a better grasp of object permanence. They understand that when mom or dad leaves, they still exist and will come back. Before that, the separation can feel more like an existential crisis. This is why many developmental psychologists suggest that if you have the flexibility, avoiding a start date between 8 and 11 months is ideal. Either start earlier, around 5 or 6 months, so the routine is established before the anxiety peaks, or wait until the peak has passed after the first birthday.
That is a very practical takeaway for anyone listening who is currently looking at calendars. But let's look at the second order effects. What happens when these early start kids get to primary school? Is there a fade-out effect where the kids who stayed home catch up, or do the daycare kids maintain an edge? Because we are often sold daycare as a way to get ahead.
It depends on what you are measuring. For academic skills, literacy, and numeracy, there is a documented daycare advantage that usually fades by the 3rd grade. The kids who stayed home catch up quickly once they are in a formal school environment. However, the social-emotional differences can persist. Kids who are in high-quality, stable daycare often show better pro-social behavior. They share better, they navigate conflict more easily, and they have higher executive function scores. But, and this is a big but, kids who are in low-quality, high-stress daycare often show higher levels of externalizing behaviors, like aggression or impulsivity, that can persist all the way into adolescence. The quality of the daycare acts as a multiplier for the child's innate temperament.
So the quality threshold is the real variable. It is not just about the age. It is about whether the environment is additive or subtractive to the child's development. I suspect the nanny share culture we see in urban hubs like New York or London is an attempt to bridge this gap. You get the socialization of a small peer group, maybe 2 or 3 kids, but the stability of a single caregiver in a home-like environment. It is almost like a synthetic version of the village.
The nanny share is essentially a high-end attempt to recreate the alloparenting village for the modern professional class. It limits the pathogen load as well, which is another factor we haven't touched on. The daycare plague is a real thing. Children who start early in large centers have significantly higher rates of ear infections and respiratory issues in the first 2 years. While some argue this builds the immune system, the research suggests that the stress of chronic illness in infancy can actually have a negative impact on long-term health markers like asthma or even cardiovascular health. It is better to get those illnesses at age 3 or 4 when the immune system is more robust than at 6 months when the body is still putting all its energy into brain development.
I remember we touched on some of the foundational attachment science back in episode 437. If people want to understand the why behind the cortisol spikes, that is a good one to revisit. But looking forward, I am curious about how this changes with the shift in work culture. We have more parents working from home, but they are still working. I see this new trend of co-working with childcare popping up in places like Austin and Berlin.
Those co-working creches are an interesting middle ground. It allows for shorter separation periods and the ability for the parent to pop in for a lunch visit, which can help regulate that HPA axis stress response. However, it can also be disruptive. For some children, seeing their parent midday and then having them leave again is actually more stressful than a single drop-off and pickup. It really comes down to the individual temperament of the child. We often talk about children as a category, but the optimal start age for a highly sensitive orchid child is going to be very different from a more resilient dandelion child.
That is a great point. A dandelion child might thrive in a bustling French creche at 6 months, finding the noise and the other kids exciting, while an orchid child might be completely overwhelmed and shut down, leading to those high cortisol levels we talked about. If the age isn't the primary lever for success, then the lever is actually fit. But how does a parent even measure that?
This is where I think the future of this space is going. By 2030, I suspect we will see more personalized childcare assessments. Imagine a world where we use basic temperament screening or even non-invasive physiological monitoring to help parents decide if their child is ready for a group environment. We already do this with school readiness for 5-year-olds. Why aren't we doing it for infants? We could identify which children need a lower ratio or a later start date based on their biological stress markers.
It feels a bit Brave New World to have a toddler wearing a stress monitor, but I get the logic. If we can see that a specific child's cortisol isn't recovering, we can intervene before it becomes a developmental set point. But let's get into the practical side for Daniel and our listeners. If you are staring at a daycare application today, in March of 2026, what are the actual metrics you should be looking at beyond the vibe of the place?
First and foremost, ask about staff turnover. Don't just ask what is your turnover, ask how many of the lead teachers in the infant room have been here for more than 2 years. If the answer is none, that is a massive red flag, regardless of how nice the wooden toys are or how many organic snacks they serve. Second, look at the caregiver to child ratio. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends a 1:3 ratio for infants under 12 months. Many states allow 1:4 or even 1:5. That extra child makes a huge difference in the responsiveness of the caregiver. In a 1:5 ratio, the caregiver is essentially just doing triage all day.
Responsive caregiving is the buffer we keep talking about. If a baby cries and the caregiver is busy with 4 other kids, that toxic stress starts to accumulate. You want to see serve and return interactions. The baby babbles, the teacher responds with a word or a smile. It sounds simple, but it is the literal building block of brain architecture. If the teacher is just propping up bottles and changing diapers in a silent room, the child isn't learning. They are just surviving.
It really is. And the third thing is the pedagogical framework. You want a place that prioritizes free play and social interaction over academic prep. There is no reason for an 18-month-old to be looking at flashcards or a screen. They should be playing with sand, water, and each other. The socialization benefit of daycare only kicks in when the children are actually allowed to socialize, not when they are being managed like a tiny workforce.
It is funny how we have created this high-pressure environment for toddlers. I have seen daycare websites bragging about their STEM curriculum for 2-year-olds. It is absurd. They are learning physics by dropping their spoon on the floor. They don't need a curriculum for it. They need a caregiver who says, "Oh, look, the spoon fell down."
They really don't. The best STEM for a toddler is a pile of dirt and a magnifying glass. But back to the cultural comparison, I think we should look at the communal rearing models in places like Israel or certain parts of Africa. In the traditional kibbutz model in Israel, for example, there was a time when children lived in children's houses, almost from birth. That was an extreme version of the early start model. They found that while it created very strong peer bonds, the kibbutz generation was incredibly resilient and socially connected. It sometimes weakened the primary parent-child attachment. Modern kibbutzim have moved away from that and toward familial arrangements, which shows that even the most dedicated collectivist experiments eventually realize the biological necessity of the parental bond.
It is a feedback loop. We try these extreme models, see the developmental bill come due, and then move back toward the center. The village needs to support the parent, not replace them. I think that is the core insight here. Daycare should be an extension of the family support system, not a substitute for it. But that is hard to achieve when the system is built on profit margins and labor participation.
And that is why the economic necessity part of the conversation is so frustrating. Many parents in the US aren't choosing an early start because they think it is developmentally superior. They are doing it because they will lose their jobs if they don't. When we compare US outcomes to Norwegian outcomes, we aren't just comparing daycare, we are comparing stress levels of the entire family unit. A parent who is stressed about money and job security is going to have a different interaction with their child at 6 p.m. than a parent who has had a year of paid leave and a state-supported return to work. The daycare impact is often just a proxy for poverty and policy impact.
It is a systemic issue. We are asking daycare to solve a problem that is actually a labor and policy problem. If we want better developmental outcomes, we might need to look at parental support as much as childcare quality. But until the policy catches up, parents have to make these local optimizations. It is about doing the best you can with the tools you have.
It is about local optimization. You look at your child's temperament. Are they an orchid or a dandelion? You look at the stability of the facility, and you try to time the entry to avoid those peak anxiety windows if possible. And you don't beat yourself up if the ideal isn't possible. The human brain is remarkably resilient, provided there is at least one stable, responsive relationship in the child's life. If that relationship is strong at home, it can mitigate a lot of the suboptimal factors of a daycare environment. The buffer doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be there.
That is a reassuring note to end the substantive part on. It is not about perfect, it is about good enough and stable. The village might be a bit fragmented these days, but we are all trying to piece it back together. Parenting is a local optimization problem, not a global one. You aren't raising a child, you are raising your child.
We are. And I think the more we talk about the why behind these developmental markers, the more empowered parents feel to ask the right questions. It moves the conversation from mom guilt to informed advocacy. When you know that turnover is the key metric, you stop looking at the paint color and start looking at the people.
Well said, Herman. I think we have covered a lot of ground today, from the HPA axis to the STEM for toddlers. Nonsense. If you are navigating this transition right now, just remember that the staff turnover metric is your best friend when auditing a center. It tells you more about the vibe than any brochure ever will.
It really does. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, you should definitely check out episode 437, where we break down the daycare dilemma from a safety and science perspective. It complements what we talked about today regarding the attachment buffer and the long-term health implications of early illness.
This has been My Weird Prompts. A huge thanks to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It is a topic that hits home for so many families, including his own with Ezra. We appreciate the prompt, Daniel, and we hope Ezra is thriving, whatever the start age ended up being.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We couldn't do it without that serverless magic.
If you are finding these discussions helpful, the best way to support us is to leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
Or you can find us on Telegram by searching for My Weird Prompts to get notified whenever a new episode drops. We love the community there and the discussions that happen after the show.
All right, Herman, I think that is a wrap. Go get some of that pro-social interaction you were talking about. Maybe find a pile of dirt and a magnifying glass.
I am on it. See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.